Thank you very much indeed, David. I'm greatly honoured to have been invited to address the Iona Institute on this hugely important and significant topic for us. If I could just say, I'm also very grateful. It's the first chance I've had an opportunity to do so publicly, just to acknowledge the work of the Iona Institute. A few years ago, I made a suggestion that we should have a kind of a Catholic academy in this country that would be a forum and a focus for the kinds of debates that the Iona Institute has facilitated since its inception, and would really be, I suppose, a nucleus of intellectual discourse in the public square, where the Catholic voice could be articulated and heard. And I really think the Iona Institute is doing a marvellous job in that regard. Just to say, my role in Immaculate College, I've been there for the last 13 years as head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies in the Arts faculty. Religious education is under our education faculty. We're good friends. We say the cowboy and the farmer must be friends. So I have colleagues in religious education who are more directly involved in the primary teaching than we are. Until last year, in fact, we also offered theology as an academic subject to BEds, but the Teaching Council removed all academic subjects from the BEd last year, and the new BEd programme is only about pedagogy. It's only about education. It's something that's gone very unnoticed, actually, in the public forum. Until now, we've had primary teachers who at least were qualified to degree level in an academic subject as well as education, coming out of both St. Pat's and Mary Immaculate College. But that has changed. So the students I have now are nearly all just liberal arts students. I shouldn't say just liberal arts students, but liberal arts students taking a degree and take theology in their degree programme. Our topic today is the protection of denominational education, and this arises from the government's acceptance of the report on the Forum on Patronage and Pluralism last year and its initial steps to seek the report's implementation. I'm taking as a given the right to state-funded denominational schools in Irish and international law, which is already well argued in a briefing note of the Iona Institute and need not concern us in this paper. I want to begin by making a few remarks about the process underway by mutual agreement between the government and church bodies, which is aimed at bringing about the divesting of denominational patronage by a small number of primary schools. I will then turn to the main focus of this paper, the safeguarding of the ethos of schools that will not be divested. It is clear that standalone schools, as they are called, will need to continue to be accommodating towards some pupils of other religious beliefs and none. And I say continue because they are already doing so. The issue is how to respond to this continuing need to be inclusive and respect diversity, while at the same time fully embracing and reflecting their characteristic spirit as denominational schools. And I think we'd like to see that they would do so even more than perhaps some of them are doing already. The issue of divesting a small number of schools of their denominational patronage is not particularly contentious and in fact is relatively straightforward, at least from the Catholic Church's perspective. The Catholic Church is in favour of divesting schools for two main reasons. First of all, it recognises that demographics have changed and also religious commitment and practice, leading not so much to the over-provision of Catholic schools but an under-provision of alternatives. The Church welcomes and wishes to facilitate the legitimate rights of the minority of parents who wish to send their children to non-denominational or multi-denominational schools. Its whole approach to this matter seeks to underpin and support the rights and wishes of parents. The Catholic Church welcomes greater provision of alternative school patronage for another reason. It hopes that this will enable the schools that remain Catholic to get on with being so, without any expectation that their ethos will be diminished or diluted by the need to accommodate those of other faiths or none. More on this later. Minister Rory Quinn has recently reiterated his wish that diversity of choice can become a reality across the country. The divesting of Catholic schools is proving to be somewhat of a problem, however. If the pilot survey is indicative, then the demand is not as great as the Minister anticipated. And so, in his push at the moment to bring about the level of diversity he's looking for, if this isn't actually being borne out by the demand on the ground, I think they're leaving themselves open to an accusation of some form of social engineering. The government's press release follows the publication of the results of the pilot survey in 5 areas. And it puts a brave face on the figures and claims that, quote, there is parental demand for a greater choice of patron in each town, unquote. But the reality is that a very large number of the parents who responded indicated that they wished to have their children educated in Catholic schools. In fact, the pilot survey proved to be a surprising endorsement of denominational education. The actual number of parents who expressed an opinion in favour of change in each of the 5 areas polled in the pilot survey amounted to somewhere between 5 and 8%, perhaps 10% at most. It's actually not all that clear, how, for me at least, how to read some of the findings. This is, however, evidence of parental demand, certainly, but hardly of a strong or clear demand or clear need for greater choice, as the findings were reported in the press. I mean, if one student in my class demands that I open the curtains because the classroom is too dark, well, that's a clear demand. It's a clear need, but it's not necessarily a strong or a great demand if there are 100 or 200 students in the classroom. So the use of the language here is actually quite significant. Moreover, a large majority of parents did not participate in the survey at all. And of course, it's speculation to conclude that the majority of those who did not participate were quite happy with the status quo. But this would seem to be what a vox pop of parents in the surveyed areas conducted by RT News suggested. The Minister now has asked each of the patrons to consult with their local school communities on the implementation of the survey's findings. Minister Quinn said, I quote, "I will now ask the main patron in each area, the Catholic bishop or archbishop, to consider the reconfiguration options open to him which would allow sufficient school accommodation to be made available to facilitate this choice," unquote. However, having considered the actual findings of the survey as well as the poor participation rates, it is questionable whether or not a Catholic patron has a reliable basis on which to initiate a process of change of patron, as has been requested by the Minister. In any event, the signs are that far fewer schools will end up being divested than originally anticipated, at least by some. I've said enough here on this issue. We'll have to wait the outcome of the more substantial survey underway before being able to comment any further. I now want to move on to the matter, in a sense, the focal point of this particular presentation, the matter of protecting the ethos of the schools that will not be divested, the standalone schools. I'd like for a few moments to speak a little more personally, if I may, in addressing this topic of denominational education. I suppose two of the most important aspects of my own life come together. Teaching, I've been involved in full-time teaching since effectively all of my priesthood, and the handing on of the Christian faith. My mother was a teacher, a science teacher in secondary school, and I grew up watching her preparing her classes on the kitchen table at home, working out how to make biology and science experiments interesting and understandable to her pupils. She was a very fine teacher, as indeed those she taught have told me on and off over the years when I'd bump into somebody and say, "Your mother taught me." At home, I remember her showing me how everyday household chemicals worked when combined, and how, for instance, to make a battery using salt and water. I can also recall her gathering, or asking me to gather, tadpoles for her to bring to school and the occasional frog, and then my father shooting an odd rabbit for her to dissect in class. These were the more interesting and exciting lessons around the family home. She also taught maths and calculus, and that was somewhat less exciting. But this means that as far back as I can remember, I suppose, I've been preoccupied with the whole business of knowledge and how to absorb it and to communicate it. And all of my professional life, as I say, I've been involved in education, whether through various teaching appointments I've held or working informally in particular youth organisations such as the Scout movement. Both my upbringing and my experience in the classroom and outside it have taught me that I can only teach what I am passionate about, what I really believe in, and this is what I actually teach, whether regardless of the curriculum, well, almost regardless of the curriculum. What I hold dearly is what I communicate to others, whether I wish to or not, or whether I'm explicitly aware of it or not. And I think a lot of educational theory actually disempowers us from that clear insight, to be very honest, which we know in our hearts that that is the reality. I'm sure if you think back to your own schooling experience, the teachers that did most for you in any real or lasting sense are those that through their own passionate commitment and love of their subject evoked in you a love of learning and of knowledge and taught you how this could make a difference in your life. It wasn't so much about agreeing with them or blindly accepting what they taught, but more about learning the value of knowledge and the process of learning in and for itself. Of course, we all had to learn things off to get through exams and get points, but that wasn't really education in any meaningful sense of the word. I believe the best of educational pedagogy supports what we know from common sense. There is, in fact, a strong correlation between teachers' own beliefs and the influences, emphases and intuitions they bring to bear both in the classroom and in the school corridor. And this is why, for example, Section 37 of the Quality Employment Act is an important pillar in the protection of denominational education. So this sort of more personal reflection on what it is to be a teacher brings me to my main concern about the report on the Forum on Patronage and Pluralism. I'm concerned that its findings and recommendations are based upon an inadequate and reductionist understanding of what education is really about. Among the recommendations the Forum makes in order that denominational schools be more inclusive and respect diversity is the displaying among the recommendations the Forum makes in order that denominational schools be more inclusive and respect diversity is the displaying of non-Christian symbols and the celebration of non-Christian festivals, as well as the adaptation of hymns and prayers so that they would be, quote, respectful of the beliefs and cultures of all children, unquote. Now, this latter recommendation, and I think it's actually quite a revealing one, is somewhat curious when you realise that hymns and prayers are very specific formulae of worship within particular faith traditions. I'm not sure how one could make them inclusive of the beliefs and cultures of all children without rendering them either meaningless and or disrespectful to the tradition from which they've come. In addition, the Forum report recommended the deletion of Rule 68, not its modification, its deletion. Now, this rule states, of all the parts of a school curriculum, religious instruction is by far the most important, as its subject matter, God's honour and service, includes the proper use of all man's faculties and affords the most powerful inducements to their proper use. Religious instruction is, therefore, a fundamental part of the school course, and a religious spirit should inform and vivify the whole work of the school. Rule 68 protects the denominational character of a school in two respects. The first is that it allows for a religious spirit to inform and vivify the whole work of the school. If this is deleted, then there will be no underpinning to the legal right and responsibility of patrons to uphold and foster a characteristic spirit or ethos in accordance with the school's patronage. The second important aspect of Rule 68 is in regard to religious instruction, which, recognising the distinctive nature of religious education, is privileged in the day-to-day life of the school. The Forum report recognises that generally subjects in the primary school are to be taught in an integrated manner. Ironically, however, religious education, which by its very nature underpins and integrates the whole of human life and learning, is singled out by the Forum report to be taught as a discrete subject apart from all other subjects. But so far we've only looked at one half of Rule 68. Although the Forum report recommends the deletion of the entire rule, it only refers to that first paragraph which we've looked at. There is a second paragraph to Rule 68 which has received hardly any attention, and this reads as follows. The teacher should constantly inculcate the practice of charity, justice, truth, purity, patience, temperance, obedience to lawful authority, and all the other moral values. In this way, he will fulfil the primary duty of an educator, the moulding to perfect form of his pupils' character, habituating them to observe in their relations with God and with their neighbour the laws which God, both directly through the dictates of natural reason and through revelation, and indirectly through the ordinance of lawful authority, imposes on mankind. Now, one would have thought that a rule concerning the inculcation of the practice of charity, justice, truth, purity, patience, temperance and obedience to lawful authority and all the other moral virtues might at least have been considered for modification rather than straightforward deletion. The language here is admittedly archaic, at least some would see it that way, but the content and the sentiment are certainly not. And Rule 68 summarises very well what education, and not just denominational education, but education itself, is really about. If a Catholic school cannot fulfil what is described here as the primary duty of an educator, then it would cease to be a Catholic school, and arguably cease to be a school at all in any meaningful sense of the word. The recommendation, in line with what it claims was, quote, the general view expressed at the forum, unquote, to delete rather than just update or explicate Rule 68, perhaps make it more inclusive in some way, in my view, leaves the forum report open to an accusation of ideological bias. Rule 68 protects against the secular liberal view of education that the nature of the human person and the meaning and goal of life are merely matters of arbitrary opinion, and these are at best ignored or at least left unexplored in a school context, while we get on with the business of addressing standards in numeracy and literacy and the provision of a better pupil product. I have been shocked in recent times at meetings of, shall we say, official bodies involved in the delivery of education in this country to hear students being referred to as products without a flicker of an eyelid. And I think that really reveals what I see as a very truncated and diminished understanding of education that is operative. A few years ago, Alistair McIntyre quipped that the problem with a lot of Catholic universities is not that they cease to be Catholic, but that they cease to be universities. I fear that the problem nowadays we're facing here too is not that Catholic education is on the line, but education itself is also on the line. So what is Catholic education really about? Perhaps the best way to understand what is at stake here is to remind ourselves of what Catholic education is really about. Of course, we have to acknowledge fully and somewhat sadly that some Catholic educators did not live up to what they professed, with devastating consequences in our recent history. Catholic education, I'm quoting here, begins with the conviction that the human person is not a series of unconnected compartments, end of quote. This is why any attempt to confine religious education to a discrete component within a denominational school is to strike at the very heart of denominational education. Catholic education proceeds from a particular truth claim. It claims that Jesus Christ reveals to us what it is to be fully human, and that in him we learn, in an otherwise undiscoverable way, the full dignity and divine destiny to which human beings are called. In light of this, and enlightened by it, Catholic education sets out to communicate all that is proper to the human person. The quest for knowledge inevitably leads to a quest for truth and for wisdom, unless it is deliberately curtailed. That is the natural quest for knowledge. Christian faith holds that the search for ultimate truth is at the heart of what it is to be human, and sets out in an intellectually responsible and rigorous manner to engage people in that search with all the resources of its rich tradition. Now, of course, in a primary school, that's done in an age-appropriate way, but nonetheless, it is that wonderful interplay between faith and reason that must be at work at whatever stage we're involved in Catholic education, whether it's in fourth level PhD, advanced studies we're talking about, or at primary. A Catholic school will be tolerant, inclusive and respectful of difference and otherness. It will also promote academic freedom and religious freedom, understanding all of these as proper to the human person and fundamental to human dignity. It will do so not despite its unique insight into the truth proper to the human person revealed in Jesus Christ, or in any way as a curtailment of that, but in fact because of it and based upon it. Far from frustrating or undermining human reason, Christian faith informs and enlarges it. In contrast, reason uncoupled from faith tends to shrink into a kind of empty rationalism, and having little life-giving to contribute, nothing really to tell us about truth, about beauty, about goodness, about human suffering and redemption. It is easily replaced, as I believe we currently see in the impoverished nature of much of public discourse in this country, by a kind of crude form of emotivism. It might be argued that the state should not pay for an educational system based on such religious truth claims. However, that very perspective is itself a truth claim, as is the claim, erroneous in my view, that there can be an educational system that is not, in fact, based upon some truth claim. The claim that religion should be a private matter and of no concern to education, and that education can proceed neutrally, so to speak, without taking up or reflecting a position on ultimate questions. Perhaps that's an appropriate claim upon which to found a secularist or non-denominational school. However, it has no place in the ethos of a denominational school. A denominational school is entitled to proceed from a religious starting point, which from the state's point of view must be viewed as being equally as valid as that of the secularist. Otherwise, the state has already adopted and is in fact itself proceeding on the basis of a secularist truth claim. It is difficult to conclude from the Forum report that the many fine submissions that were made regarding the nature of Catholic education received sufficient hearing. In contrast, those made from bodies such as Atheist Ireland and the Irish Human Rights Commission would seem to be more influential in the formulation of the Forum's recommendations. It is hard to escape the conclusion that the thrust of the report is that everything genuinely formative in education is seen as a problem to be managed in the interests of political correctness, rather than the very core of what education is really about. A case in point is the recommendation that in all state-funded schools, including denominational schools, there is to be a mandatory programme entitled Education About Religions and Beliefs and Ethics. I'll call that ERB for short. The key word here is about. Education about religion is distinguished from education from a faith perspective and education in a particular faith. The introduction of this programme was requested by the IHRC as well as Atheist Ireland. Versions of it already exist in non-denominational schools, and the Forum claims that all students, including those in denominational schools, have a right to such a programme. The term have a right is used. The proposed programme is to be based upon the Toledo Guiding Principles on teaching about religions and beliefs in public schools. And the provenance of these principles is significant, and I've already dealt with that elsewhere in an article last year in the Foro. I think it was in the June edition of the Foro. The body that produced them is under the auspices of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the foreword makes clear that their context and purpose is, quote, to address the root causes of intolerance and discrimination by encouraging the development of comprehensive domestic education policies and strategies. So the principles upon which this new programme, this proposed programme, are to be based come out of a perspective that religion is really a problem to be managed, a potential cause of intolerance and discrimination to be managed. We could counter-argue that genuine religious formation and conversion is the surest path, in fact, to tolerance and respect. Indeed, the Forum itself cites research that, quote, interfaith and intercultural initiatives work best in schools where the Catholic students and parents are most committed to their own practice, unquote. Yet, arguably, the thrust of the Forum's recommendations will weaken a denominational school's ability to contribute to faith practice. In favour of ERB, Education About Religions and Beliefs, people will argue that more information about faiths and greater religious literacy among young people can only be a good thing. I realise that many in Catholic education see it that way, provided perhaps that it does not displace the catechetical approach to religious education, but is taught alongside it. Pragmatically, however, it is hard to see how time will be found on the timetable for two programmes in this area, in the area of religious information or formation. And no doubt there would be objections to so much time in the curriculum being spent on religion in any case. Personally, and I realise that some will see this as perhaps a rather extreme view, I think there are a number of problems with such a programme being offered in a denominational school at all. In my view, what is appropriate to be taught at primary level regarding other beliefs can be dealt with adequately from a catechetical perspective. The first issue I have with ERB has to do with its methodology, which is allegedly procedural neutrality. This means that the faith perspectives of pupils and teachers alike are supposedly bracketed. Teachers are not to disclose to pupils their own views or allow such views to influence their teaching. What is required of the teacher is not religious commitment, but rather a positive attitude towards difference and the ability not to impose their views upon others. A development of this approach views the teacher as a facilitator and the pupils as co-learners who are to be enabled to interpret information about religions in light of their expanding personal experience. I'll just skip the next paragraph. This valorisation of pupils' own experiences leads pupils inevitably to the secularist belief that religious truth claims are merely relative. Therefore, the content and pedagogy of such a module is not really neutral at all. I think neutrality is never neutral. In fact, the notion that religious knowledge can be communicated neutrally is itself a secular belief. No education programme can bracket its formative dimension. So the proposed ERB programme unavoidably forms students in a secularist understanding of religion. Apart from religious objections, the view that a teacher can really practice a kind of non-directive, facilitative neutrality in the classroom when discussing religious issues are naive about the power dynamics that are inevitably at work in the pupil-teacher relationship. Teachers always exercise some power over their pupils, and their own beliefs are always influential. There's a further problem with the ERB. It attempts to present religious beliefs, rituals, images and artefacts objectively and factually. By so doing, it disembeds them from their rootedness in a shared living tradition and community. Without the living faith of the community providing their context and horizon of interpretation, beliefs and rituals can at best be understood superficially. For Christians, relationship with God and one another in Christ is not an optional extra alongside our beliefs and sacraments, which we can take or leave. It is everything. It is in and from this relationship that we come to know what our beliefs and rituals are really about. If I can just stop there for a moment, just to give a little example to crystallise what I'm saying here. And it's kind of a very trivial example in terms of what we're dealing with, but it might just form it for us. If you go into the house of somebody you're very friendly with or close to and so on, there's something on a rather strange object on the table. It could be a vase. And you say, that's a lovely vase. Where did you buy that and how much did it cost? And they say, well, actually my grandmother gave me that vase and it's very precious to me because it was one she always had on. There's a story. There's a story to go with that. And they say the price of everything and the value of nothing. This approach to religion tells you the price of everything but the value of nothing. That's my concern with it. It lifts artefacts or objects, like in our tradition, the Catholic tradition, we could be talking about the sacraments or the cross or the rosary or whatever else, and can only look at them in a very superficial and external way. It disembowels them. It's a form of what's called detraditionalisation. And so they will know the information as externally about it, but they can't really know what it might mean in that beloved context of a religious family. And that's my main concern. And the very fact that you try to do that is already schooling people in a particular way of looking at religion, which is essentially secularist. I'm not too far away from conclusion at this stage. As those of you who have a text in front of you, it's always good to have a text, isn't it? You can count the pages away. There's yet another difficulty. Increasingly, people see religious beliefs and rituals, symbols and icons, and this in a sense is putting the point I've just made more technically, as commodities to be assimilated into their lives and lifestyle, divorced from or devoid of the meaning and impact that they're meant to have in the context of the tradition in which they originate. Faced with the plurality of life views and options, such a pick and mix approach becomes seen as completely sensible and normal. There's no felt desire or need for a coherent package of religious beliefs that would guide and at times challenge one's life rather than merely offer moments of consolation and reassurance. And there's no guaranteed encounter in that kind of pick and mix approach to religion with the transcendent. Somebody said these personally designed spiritualities, these kind of that are almost a kind of an appendix to our lives, are all very well until something goes wrong. But they're also very individualistic and isolating, and there's no real community to fall back on, no shared community belief, and of course no necessary encounter at all with otherness and with the divine in them. It's a kind of consumerist approach to religion, and sadly it reflects a consumerist approach to education generally. I think the problems we're encountering with regard to religious education have their roots in this truncated understanding of education I've been talking about. Increasingly, students in all subjects are exposed to smatterings of knowledge rather than to full academic disciplines in an effort to make education relevant. In my view, the introduction of ERB and ethics as a mandatory programme in denominational schools could school pupils in a secularist view of religion and thus undermine the school's characteristic spirit. I think it's significant that Irish colleges of education, including the one where I work, have already introduced a mandatory module preparing teachers to teach ERB and ethics. And, for example, my department is not involved in it. And this is at the Teaching Council's insistence. Despite our Catholic ethos, we have not been able to make equally mandatory the offering of even an introductory module, for example, on Christian anthropology or the Christian vision of the human person. And this, again, has been very much the direction which the Teaching Council and the control, I suppose, really, that the Teaching Council exercises over programmes such as ours, the BEd. These programmes are licensed effectively by the Teaching Council, and we have to confine to their norms for recognition. So, to move to the conclusion, in terms of protecting denominational education, there are many other points which I could have made. For instance, I focused on the threats to denominational education from without. I've not detailed those that are there from within, including, for instance, that in some Catholic schools, religious formation and the school's characteristic spirit are probably not taken seriously enough, and the results are sadly evident. At the same time, there is extraordinary good work being done by Catholic teachers and principals, and this does need greater acknowledgement. And I think very often we can be very knocking of the work that's done by teachers on the ground, in the classroom. And I would hope anything that will come from here and from our discussion or anything that will be published would very much acknowledge the good work the Catholic teachers do, very often without adequate support on the ground. I know that many teachers in Catholic schools have been annoyed that their current efforts to be inclusive and to respect diversity are not sufficiently recognised. In some parishes, the reality is that the Catholic school is the only effective agent of integration of minorities and stands in the front line in this regard. In the long run, the protection of denominational education will also require greater investment in developing the relationship and the cooperation between parents, parish and school. Much good work has been done in this regard by the Catholic Schools Partnership, which in a relatively short time has produced excellent resources for parents, patrons, principals and teachers. In particular, there's a need for much closer work with parents to ensure that they value not only the high academic standards for which Catholic schools are generally renowned, but that they also value the school's characteristic spirit and the religious formation it provides. While I focused on the threats, there are also opportunities. As one Catholic educator has noted, quote, "The conflict is not between religion and the secular, but between the searchers for deeper meaning and those who believe that human life has no meaning beyond what can be measured, analysed and scientifically proved." End of quote. Increasingly, we find secular educators recognising that the empirical approach to education is deeply impoverishing, and we need to forge allegiances with such people into the future. In conclusion, speaking at the Seanad earlier last year, Minister Quinn stated, quote, "I do not believe we will get agreement from the Catholic community on the divesting of schools if it believes it is to be curtailed in terms of how it celebrates and teaches Catholicism to its own community," unquote. Frankly, I would hope that this is the case. That is, that agreement on the divesting of schools will be dependent upon guarantees regarding the protection of the characteristic spirit of the standalone schools that will not be divested. Only in this way will our schools not merely be the products of a past evangelisation, but as the recent Synod of Bishops requested, agents of evangelisation into the future. Thank you for your patience. Thank you very much.